Israel Meir Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel and the youngest survivor of Buchenwald, describes in his memoir the celebration in the camp of one of the most joyous days of the Jewish calendar, taking place in the midst of the most terrible conditions imaginable. He writes about Buchenwald as follows. Purim arrived. As with Passover, the Jews in Buchenwald decided to celebrate Purim as best they could. They could not fulfill the mitzvot of sending portions of food to friends, giving gifts to the poor, or holding a festive meal. But they could attempt to read the scroll of Esther. No one had a Megillah, a scroll, yet they did not concede defeat. Several days before the date, some of the older Jews in the camp held a meeting. They resolved to shake off their despair and try to reconstruct the Megillah from memory. Each man would write whatever verses he remembered by heart, and a committee of the elders of the block would try to reconstruct the proper order of the text. Everyone remembered the most important verses, such as, in the days of Achashverosh, for the Jews there was light and happiness, joy and glory. There was a Jewish man in Shushan the capital whose name was Mordechai, and Mordechai would not kneel or bow. They wrote out the verses with charcoal on yellow paper torn from discarded sacks of millet. On Purim Eve, writes Rabbi Lau, the Jews of Buchenwald read the improvised scroll. They could not recite the blessing since the scroll was incomplete and not written on parchment, and thus did not fulfill the conditions of the law. Still, with whatever they had dredged up from the depths of their memories, they managed to create a traditional Purim atmosphere, albeit modest due to the circumstances. At the end of the evening, the Jews sang the symbolic lines, charged with meaning. Shoshanat Yaakov tzahalav v'samecha. The rose of Jacob rejoiced and exulted. Chuatam hayita lanetzach. You have always been their salvation, their hope in every generation. All who place hope in you, God, shall not be put to shame, nor shall all those who trust in you be disgraced forever. Writes Rabbi Lau, when they sang, Cursed is Haman who sought to destroy me, no one had any doubt to whom the verse referred, and the phrase, Blessed is Mordechai the Jew, inspired everyone with great hope. End quote. What does it mean to mark a holiday when your life is anything but that? How can one celebrate Purim when every single day of your life is nothing other than Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning in the Jewish calendar? Even more profoundly, how can one maintain faith in all that Purim proclaims when your own experience appears to belie that belief? How can you say, with Mordechai, Revach ve'hatzala ya'amod la'Yehudim, that salvation will arise for the Jews, when that salvation does not seem to come? And how can you rejoice in the memory of a Haman's decree that was averted, when you yourself are the victim of a modern Haman whose decrees against the Jews brought unimaginable disaster? If there is a man who faced this question in the centuries before the Second World War, it was Don Isaac Abravanel. In all the annals of Jewish history, it is difficult to find someone like him, a man who served in courts throughout Europe while emerging as one of the seminal Torah scholars of Jewish history. But he is also, and perhaps first and foremost, someone who led a community at one of its most terrible moments, and was tasked with sustaining their faith during an experience that was beyond imagining. It so happens that thanks to the schedule we have set up for our statesmanship series, we turn to the tale of Abravanel as Jews around the world prepare for Purim. And this was utterly unintentional and perhaps purely coincidental, and yet the very message of Purim appears to be that there is no coincidence. And as we shall see, it is this belief that lay at the heart of Abravanel's own worldview. I will argue today that the story of Purim, rightly understood, is at the heart of Abravanel's story, in ways that are both terribly tragic and also immensely inspiring. In engaging Abravanel's story, I will draw on the remarkable biography by the historian Ben-Zion Netanyahu, and my citations of Abravanel in translation are from him, except for I'm quoting and translating from the Hebrew directly. In this spirit, without intending in any way to cause any controversy or take any position whatsoever on the matter, I will be utilizing Netanyahu's preferred pronunciation of the name Abravanel, rather than Abarbanel. I understand how people take the specifics of rabbinic names very seriously. There is, of course, some who spell, for example, the name Soloveitchik with a T. I've told my students in college that this is not a big deal either, except that if they spell my name with a T, they will receive an F in the course. But hopefully we will derive lessons from Abravanel's life that are far beyond the specifics of his name. I must also say that the political experiences and intellectual writings of Abravanel are so vast that a true appraisal in a single lecture is absolutely impossible. And thus, I am first and foremost focusing on aspects of his life that speak to me. But this cannot sufficiently summarize the astonishing experiences and achievements of this man. And so we begin. Today, the very name Abravanel, or Abarbanel, is synonymous with political heroism and spiritual and intellectual excellence. But we cannot appreciate the figure that we study this evening without understanding that before him, before the name Abravanel became known for spiritual greatness, it was by Jews in Spain associated with apostasy. The patriarch of the Abravanel family, Isaac Abravanel's grandfather, Don Samuel, a prominent figure among the Jews of Spain, converted to Christianity long before the expulsion. The precise cause of the conversion is unknown, but as Netanyahu notes, scholarship has disproven what was once taken for granted, that he had been forced in some way. As Netanyahu has it, quote, "What we know is that he never returned to Judaism, that he devoted himself strictly to his social rise and the amassing of a great fortune, that he reached the highest stations in the king's financial service, and that many of his offspring intermarried with Spain's nobles," end quote. This means that there was from the very beginning a terrible rift in the family, with some of the children of Don Samuel fleeing the stain of their father's choice. And it is this that motivated one of his oldest children, Don Judah Abravanel, one of Don Samuel's oldest children, to make his way to Portugal. Even though he escaped from Spain and from the Spanish Jewish community and from the stain of scandal, there is no question that nevertheless his father's painful legacy would have weighed greatly on him and therefore on his son their entire life. But if Don Judah left behind his father's conversion, he did not in Portugal leave behind the family vocation of serving kings. Don Judah Abravanel took up the service of the Portuguese monarch Alfonso V and that of a noble family, the house of the Duke of Braganza. From his courtier father, Abravanel would have received, as Netanyahu notes, along with a training in Torah, an education in the entire intellectual tradition of the West, meaning he would have received whatever education that courtiers and nobility were receiving. As he entered adulthood, Isaac Abravanel served both Alfonso and the Duke's family in both the financial and political sphere. And it is clear that for the Braganzas, he, Isaac Abravanel, was considered indispensable. In Netanyahu's words, quote, "We do not know what services Abravanel rendered in the management of their tremendous fiefs, but he must have fulfilled some vital tasks, for we know that he was compensated in abundant measure. He himself, Abravanel, became the owner of vast estates, some of which came to him in all likelihood as gifts from his grateful and magnanimous friends." So rendered this way, Abravanel could be seen as akin to other court Jews in Jewish history. But here, ladies and gentlemen, is where it gets really interesting. What we find between Isaac Abravanel and the noble family of Braganza is more than an association of mutual self-interest. It is a genuine friendship. Testament can be found to that in a moving letter that Abravanel wrote to the son of the Duke, the Count of Faro, consoling him following the death of his father-in-law. Abravanel speaks to him of mourning, commiseration, and guides him, his noble friend, from his sorrow back to life, back to engagement with the world. And as you read the letter, you realize this is not merely a courtier consoling the man he serves. This is not a yes man attempting to buck up his boss. This is a friend consoling a friend. And, if I may speak a little anachronistically, this is nothing less than a rabbi engaging in pastoral counseling. Only he's doing it with a Christian nobleman in Portugal. Abravanel, as we shall see, refers even in his Hebrew writings, when he's writing for Jews, and when Portugal was in the past, to the incredible affection that existed between himself and the Braganzas. I recently had the pleasure in my synagogue of convening a reunion between descendants of Abravanel with the current Duke of Braganza, His Royal Highness Duarte Pio João Miguel Gabriel Rafael. That's all one person. That's his name. Now, I watch Downton Abbey, and I enjoy hosting a duke as much as the next person. But the reason I did it, and what I wish to highlight, was together with the synagogue when we hosted him, and the Barbanels, as they call themselves, as they still call themselves, these descendants of a Barbanel, what I wish to highlight was the humanism that this friendship embodied. We touch then on an astonishing irony that a man whose life will become bound up with the story of anti-Semitism and the horrible havoc that it will wreak in the life of the story of the Jewish people, this very same man in the life that he lived testifies in small moments of his career to the possibility of genuine fellowship between Jew and Gentile. This was, therefore, in Portugal, a golden moment in his life. Power, wealth, and fellowship with the Gentile ruling class, unlike that experienced by most Jews in diaspora history. And then suddenly, it all went up in smoke. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik has commented that the story of Purim is marked by the celebration of Purim, is marked by a preceding fast. Because at the heart of our celebration is also something fearful. The terrifying reminder that the moment Jews find relative freedom, even influence in the diaspora, anywhere, they can suddenly lose it all. On Purim, we celebrate V'nahapochu, that all was reversed. But reversal can go the other way. And that, for Abravanel, is exactly what happened. In 1483, a new king took the throne, John II, who turned against the Duke of Braganza, his relative. And then the new king also set his sights on the loyal Jewish steward of the House of Braganza. As Abravanel put it, he was targeted by the new Portuguese king. Yan miyemei kedem kadmata biyamim harishonim hayta avati atzuma et hasarim hanidafim ha'ela. Because he writes, and he's writing this for Jews, for many years my love was very fierce for the nobles that were pursued, for the Braganza family. So consider the reversal, ladies and gentlemen, that has occurred here. The very same historically exceptional friendship. For Abravanel, love was not too strong a word. Between Jew and Christian, between Abravanel and Braganza, that friendship, so incredible, so exceptional, became the very source of the danger that presented itself to Abravanel. He was forced to flee, leaving his home, his writings, his sources of study, and all his wealth and property. He sought sanctuary in Spain, and the man who was the model of Jewish achievement in Portugal arrived on Spanish soil with nothing to his name, or as he put it in Jewish legal terms, Vayikach et kol asher li, karkai agav metaltali, ad beli hishir li, sarid. The king of Portugal took from my family all I had, my land and my possessions, till I had not a speck remaining. And as he tells us in his own account, at that moment, having lost everything, Abravanel asked God, why had he done this to him? Hashofet kol haaretz, he cried, lo yaseh mishpat. Shall not the judge of the world do justice? And it is Abravanel's response to this very question that he raised that is remarkable. Because Abravanel could have merely denounced what fate had brought upon him. He could have said that perhaps he had not been favored to receive God's providence, that all had happened according to chance. But Abravanel instead assumed that there was no coincidence here. God, he assumed, must be punishing him. There must be a lesson to be learned, an atonement that was asked of him. And then Abravanel seized on a sin. He had, as a young man, absorbed the Torah, but he had not taught it. Lo darashta me'al sefer Hashem lishmoa balimudim. You, he says to himself, you did not teach from the scroll of God. And then I realized, he writes, Tov li torat picha me'alfei zahav v'chesef, that God's Torah is more exquisite than the multitudes of gold and silver. And so right there in Castile, right over the border of Spain, he begins to lecture to the Jews that are there, and then, as Netanyahu puts it, quote, seized by a creative urge of a strength and intensity he had never felt before, he begins to write. And for the next several weeks, the words of the Torah pour forth from within him. He wrote his commentary on Joshua in 2 weeks, on Judges in less than a month, and then commentary on both books of Samuel in 100 days. This man has lost everything. He has no library, no funds, no source of sustenance, yet the Torah is still within him. The Torah traveled with him. The Torah pours forth from him. And if you have read Abravanel's commentary, you would understand how extraordinary is what came forth. The joke about Abravanel's writings is that they always create heretics throughout history, because his discussion of every biblical passage or chapter begins with a series of many, many questions, which he only then addresses and answers in a very lengthy manner. And many, the joke says, just give up after so many questions. They're overcome by the questions and just give up on Judaism itself. That's a joke, of course. But if you actually study the length of it, you see how remarkable is the fact that he produced all of this on Joshua, Judges, and Samuel in 4.5 months, In this time, Netanyahu writes, quote, within 4.5 months, he produced 4 large volumes comprising 400,000 words. And as Netanyahu puts it, this is perhaps the first and only time that the political books of the Bible was interpreted by a statesman. So all this Abravanel does as a response to a purported providential punishment of exile from Portugal. And the events that followed immediately after appear to confirm his own theological reading of his fortune. Abravanel had assumed that he had lost political power due to his abstaining from teaching Torah. And suddenly, upon teaching Torah, he is introduced to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. It must have seemed to him as if he had read the mind of God, for he was launched again on success, serving the crown and a noble family, the House of Mendoza. Just like in Portugal, all was restored as it was, seemingly. Surely he has read God's intentions correctly. Abravanel, Netanyahu writes, quote, retained and apparently increased his holdings in the royal tax farming system, and commanding large profits from his multiple enterprises, he could now make loans comprising millions of marvedis to the queen and the war treasurer of state from 1488 on. He felt he was standing in royal favor, appreciation, and esteem. By 1491, he became the queen's personal financial representative, end quote. So Abravanel appeared to be on the brink of another golden age in his life, never apparently expecting the terrible disaster that was yet to come. Because the announcement of the expulsion edict of 1492 came as a shock to Spain's Jews. It is, in retrospect, shocking that he was shocked. After all, the Inquisition was already persecuting and torturing conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity before the threatened expulsion, and who were accused by the church of covert Jewish observance. Yet the Jews, including the great Abravanel, writes Netanyahu, quote, did not read the signs of the time. And thus, when the expulsion edict was eventually announced, it was for Spanish Jewry, quote, like a thunderbolt out of the clear sky, tumbling at last the walls of illusions behind which the Jews of Spain lived, end quote. So why, Netanyahu asks, why did Jews not sense the vicious hatred that was festering? And why did they not take the Inquisition's anti-Semitic activity more seriously? Netanyahu suggests that the Jews of Spain incorrectly assumed that the Inquisition was concerned solely with the religious beliefs of those who identified as Christians. But the way the Inquisition spoke about the Jews should have alerted the Jewish community to the church's ultimate aims. The Inquisition spoke of the polluting blood of the Jews of Spain and of the Jewish character that they called sinister, from which Spanish Christians must be protected. This is all described by Netanyahu, and I've written elsewhere about Netanyahu's history and his understanding of Abravanel in this context. Yet the Jews, as Netanyahu argues, chose to see the Inquisition as motivated only by a crusading Christian fervor and not by a deeper hatred of the Jewish people. The most peculiar aspects of the years leading up to the expulsion, writes Netanyahu, is the fact that, quote, the Inquisition, instead of serving as a warning, contributed to a deceptive sense of peace, end quote. All this is Netanyahu's argument that I'm citing. For Benzion Netanyahu, Spanish Jewry's complacency and their embrace of a convenient narrative reveals what he calls, quote, man's natural reluctance to draw radical conclusions which imply uprooting oneself from a comfortable spot. Just as German Jews, quote, failed to foresee Hitler's rise to power at any time during the period preceding that rise, so the Jews of Spain failed to notice, even a few years before the expulsion, the mountainous waves which was approaching to overwhelm them, end quote. The failure by one of the greatest communities in Jewish diaspora history, the Jews of Spain, to sense this threat was for Netanyahu, quote, nothing short of proverbial. Then the edict is announced. Jews must convert or leave. At this point, all efforts by the Jews privileged to have a place in the Spanish court focused on reversing this decree. These Jews were primarily 3: Abravanel, Abraham Senior, and Senior's son-in-law, Meir Melamed. The Jewish community appears to have been confident, as Netanyahu recounts, in the ability of Abravanel and his colleagues to avert their doom. And an enormous sum was offered to Ferdinand, but to no avail. Abravanel then turns to Queen Isabella and speaks as a Jewish hero. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is one moment that I would so dearly desire, if I could pick moments in Jewish diaspora history, to have been a fly on the wall for this scene Abravanel stood before Isabella and spoke from his heart. Here is how Netanyahu describes what he said, quote, "He spoke now like a scion of the house of David, and as a representative of an unconquerable and unconquered people. An unconquered and unconquerable people. He spoke to her, moreover, like a prophet of old, in daring, castigating, and threatening language. If Isabella thought that by measures like expulsion the Jews could be brought down, she was greatly mistaken. He pointed out to her," writes Netanyahu, "the eternity of the Jewish people, that it was beyond human capacity to destroy the Jewish people, and that those who tried to do so only invited upon themselves divine punishment and disaster." End quote. This is what he said before the Queen of Spain. The king and queen resisted his rhetoric and successfully prevailed on Abraham Senior and Meir Melamed to convert to Christianity, as did their entire family. The king and queen sought to attain Abravanel's conversion as well, and one can only imagine the pressure that he experienced, to which we shall return. But he steadfastly refused. Many Jews did convert. Many did not. Many loyal Jews turned to Portugal, but this was not an option for Abravanel, for he was still a wanted man there, and so to Italy he turned. But I would like to add a point here, ladies and gentlemen, and that is that I suspect that this was even more crushing than historians often recount. Because upon entering in exile again, Abravanel did as he had previously done when dealt a crushing blow by life. He turned to Torah. And one of the commentaries he wrote was on the Book of Kings. And in his preface to this commentary, he gives an account of how he attempted to prevent the expulsion. And as always, his writing is filled with biblical allusions. But often here, when you read this account, it is allusions specifically to the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther that stands out. He describes how the decree came about. And he mentions that this occurred Be'et, and he tried to work against it. Be'et hayoti sham ani b'chatzar beit hamelech. At the time when I was in the courtyard of the king. This is a phrase from the Book of Esther. He's describing himself as a Jew in the royal court like Mordechai. And then in seeking the help of Christian nobility to avert the decree, he writes how karati lemahevai ro'ei pnei hamelech levakesh alami. I call to my friends who see the face of the king to request mercy for my people. Here too, these are phrases taken directly from the Book of Esther. This is exactly what Mordechai asked Esther to do, levakesh al-ama, to plead for her people. And then he writes, when all of his pleading and activism proved no avail, he continues, uvechol makom asher dvar hamelech v'dato magia, Evel gadol Yehudim. In every place where the words of the king reached, there was great mourning by the Jews, meaning of the Jews in Spain. This is, of course, also a direct phrase from the Book of Esther. And in the use of this phrase, there is, of course, a terrible irony, because in Esther, this phrase appears as the initial reaction to Haman's decree, which is, of course, ultimately reversed, so that then the Megillah could say that in all places where the word of the king reached, there was joy among the Jews. Here, however, the mourning is the finality in Spain. It is mourning for what is about to come, the decree that cannot be averted. Abravanel was living a life of Mordechai. He was in the king's court. But the truth is that in every Purim existence hovers the potential for Tisha B'Av. It's interesting that in some Jewish traditions of trup, cantillation, the tune for reading, the Book of Esther is read in a tune that's not all that different and somewhat close to the tune that we use when we read from the Book of Lamentations on the 9th of Av. And when the phrase alluded to by Abravanel is actually read in the Book of Esther, for this tradition, the reader suddenly shifts slightly into a full-blown 9th of Av tune, so that the verse of mourning amidst the Jews of Persia is recited as if it were not from Esther, but from Lamentations. Evel gadol Yehudim, v'tzomu v'chi u'misped. As if suddenly what's being described is the story not of Jewish salvation, but Jewish destruction, as if we're marking not Purim, but Tisha B'Av. And indeed, with Abravanel, though he desperately sought salvation, it is destruction that occurred. And as he concludes his account by describing the book of the exile that took place, he alludes to the Book of Esther. Vayelchu b'lo choach 300,000 ragli ha'am asher anochi b'kirbo minar va'ad zakein taf v'nashim b'yom echad mikol medinot hamelech. And they went without strength, 300,000 Jews by foot, and in their midst, from young to old, children and women in one day in all the provinces of the king. Again, these phrases, minar vatzakein, biyom echad, bechol medinot hamelech, all these Hebrew phrases are from the book of Esther. This is the biblical description of Haman's plot. And indeed, it is according to Abravanel, on or around the 9th of Av, that the final expulsion from Spain occurred. So we have this joining of the story of the book of Esther and Tisha B'Av, Purim to lamentation. The intentional allusions to Esther's story in Abravanel's personal account may seem insignificant, but perhaps the citations of the Shushan story, ladies and gentlemen, are intentional, and I believe they are instructive, poignant, and profound. What he's perhaps hinting to us is what he had hoped for, what he had initially believed. The story of Purim is of Jews who were providentially placed in the court of the king in order to seek the salvation of their people. Abravanel had every reason to assume that this was his own destiny to serve in just such a capacity. For imagine, ladies and gentlemen, imagine if you had grown up assuming you were to spend your life in the service of Portugal, its king and nobility, only to lose it all. Imagine wondering why this occurred, what plan God has in store for you. Imagine that you then suddenly end up in the court of Spain, of Ferdinand and Isabella, having spent the past several years accruing power and influence, and then suddenly a decree is issued against your people. How could you not believe that the stage has been set by God for a second Purim story, one in which you, Isaac Abravanel, are called to serve as the Mordecai and Esther of Jewish history? How could you not say to yourself, how could Abravanel have not said to himself, as Mordecai did to his cousin Esther, Mi yodea im la'et kazot higat lamalchut. Perhaps for this very reason, Providence has placed you in the court of the king. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, thinking that your destiny is to be known in history as a second Mordecai. And it turns out that you will become instead the Mordecai who failed to avert the Spanish Haman's decree. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, the emotional impact that this must have had on him. He had hoped for a Purim, and he ends up with a 9th of Av. He had hoped to be Mordecai, and it turns out that he's the Mordecai who failed to avert the decree. Consider the distress that he must have experienced. Ponder the pain that must have coursed through him as he may have asked himself, why am I living a Purim tale in reverse? And there is more. Part of the grandeur of the tale of Esther and Mordecai is that they are descendants of a failed family. They are of the house of Shaul, the monarchy that did not succeed, King Saul. And it is Saul's failures against Haman's ancestor, the Amalekite Agag, for which Saul lost the throne. Soon Saul's family became known not only for failure, but treason. Mordecai and Esther themselves are named in the Megillah as descendants of Shimi, the man of Saul's family who refused to recognize David's sovereignty, who shamed King David in public and who was ultimately put to death by Solomon. It is not too much to say that Mordecai and Esther were descendants of a sort of Jewish Benedict Arnold. And the tale of Purim is one of Mordecai and Esther not only saving the Jews, but also saving their family name. And here too, in Abravanel's case, his family had left a generation before from Spain, leaving in shame when his grandfather had converted. Now the stage seemed to be set for the Jews of Spain to forever associate the name of Abravanel with the salvation of the Jews. Abravanel had every reason to expect a providential Purim. He had hoped for a Purim, and he received Tisha B'Av instead. And thus it was around Tisha B'Av they sailed, and an Italian historian cites a witness of these survivors, what they looked like on the ship sailing from Spain to Italy. I quote the translation from Netanyahu. One might have taken them for specters, so emaciated were they, so cadaverous in their aspect, and with eyes so sunken. They differed in nothing but the dead, except in the power of motion, which indeed they scarcely retained. What followed in Abravanel's life could comprise a lecture series of its own. He then served the king of Naples, establishing again so firm a fellowship that he even accompanied the king into political exile. And throughout Abravanel's travels in Italy, Corfu, and elsewhere, he wrote, composing a trilogy on Jewish messianism, a commentary on Deuteronomy and the rest of the Pentateuch, a commentary on Maimonides' Guide, a commentary on the Haggadah, and more. For Netanyahu, it was his messianism that dominates Abravanel's post-expulsion life, sustaining the Jewish people at a moment of terrible challenge to their faith, and imbuing a mysticism on Jewish eschatological expectations forever. But Eric Lowy, an excellent Abravanel scholar, notes in a fascinating article that in fact some of the most important aspects of his post-expulsion writing, including Abravanel's commentary on the Torah, these writings do not have Abravanel's focus on messianism. So messianism is part of his heritage here, but it is not the only part. And indeed, it is today through his biblical commentary that Abravanel looms largest in Jewish thought and study. In 1503, Abravanel arrived in Venice and fell in love with the political system of the Republic. He put his political genius to mediating an agreement between Venice and Portugal, and so successfully served the Republic that when he died in 1508, a remarkable funeral took place. Netanyahu describes how, quote, since under the laws of Venice the burial of Jews was prohibited with the city, his body was taken for interment at Padua, but he was given the last honors by the leaders of the Republic, as well as by leaders of his own people. It was an irregular ceremony, he writes, but most suitable in this case, for it symbolized in a way the dual course, the national, the political and the spiritual, the national and the international, which Abravanel had followed throughout his entire life. End quote. Thus, the man who experienced so many Ninth of Avs in his life died honored by Venice, as Mordechai and Esther were honored in Persia. Again, another embodiment in his life and career of Christian admiration for Jews. But we know what followed in Venice. For several decades later, it is Venice who will give Jewish history another word: ghetto. Any Purim moment in Jewish history can be followed by a Tisha B'Av. But the more Jewish exile endured, the more Abravanel's writings and faith loomed in Jewish study and Jewish history. Thus, as we evaluate Abravanel, a question is presented to us. Yes, Abravanel served kings in Portugal, Spain, and Italy. But if in the end, for Jews, it's his writings, his Torah commentary, his theology that endures, what exactly do we celebrate about him as a Jewish statesman? There is, of course, much to say here, but I would like to focus on two aspects of his legacy. First, even when Abravanel interpreted the Torah, he did so, even out of power, always as a statesman. Indeed, he is the only great Jewish exegete to do so. Abravanel seeks not only to explain prophetic and scriptural stories, but to tease out their political implications, to analyze the political philosophy of the Torah. In my own class that I give in Yeshiva College on biblical ideas in American democracy, I show my students Abravanel's commentary on the Torah reading known as Yitro, where Moses, at his father-in-law's guidance, installs political leaders at all levels of society. Abravanel interprets those passages unlike any other exegete. He sees it as a series of local and national legislatures that is akin, in the desert, amongst Israel, to the Venetian system, except that unlike Venice, the leaders in Israel for Abravanel are chosen by popular vote. One thinks for a moment when you read about local legislatures and a national legislature, all chosen by popular vote, when you read this in Abravanel, one thinks suddenly that one is reading Madison's Federalist 51. And indeed, I have called Abravanel the first Federalist. Now, I'm not saying that Abravanel is an American political figure. He's a man of his time. But still, his commentary is utterly unlike anything else in Jewish tradition, because even when he is a scholar, he never stops being a statesman. And throughout his work, he cites not only the Talmud and Jewish tradition, but also Seneca and Cicero. He was translated widely by Christian scholars and should rightly be considered one of the fathers of political Hebraism, of a tradition in the West of looking to the Bible for political instruction, and intellectual movement that ultimately so profoundly impacted America. And today, ladies and gentlemen, one of our most important tasks as intellectually engaged Jews is to look to the Torah for political insights. And therefore, whether or not we agree with a particular explanation on a passage, Abravanel, the only statesman to write a commentary on Tanakh, is the man who has taught us to see the Torah through political eyes. But even more importantly, an appraisal of Abravanel's political legacy begins and ends with the profundity of his faith. As Netanyahu notes, Abravanel had three separate positions in life. He was a statesman in Gentile courts, he was a leader of the Sephardic Jewish community, and he was a Torah scholar par excellence. Often, Abravanel engaged in these roles separately in different moments of his life. And that's understandable, because when one is engaged in court, one doesn't have the ability to write a commentary on the prophets. But in my mind, the moment that all three of these roles truly merged was when he stood before Ferdinand and Isabella, and Abravanel, when he was asked to stay, to convert, and was offered wealth, power, influence, and comfort, he spoke of the eternity of the Jewish people, and he said, no. Today, in the hindsight of history, with the reverence we rightly have for Torah figures, it is easy to see Abravanel's decision not to convert as a foregone conclusion, to paint Abravanel as a saint who didn't care at all for power and influence and wealth that he had acquired. There were many rabbis, but the truth is, there were many rabbis in Spain who could have served as his role model had he so wished. Abravanel could have been a spiritual rabbi of a community, like Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet in Barcelona, Rabbeinu Asher in Toledo, in the past. That is not who Abravanel was. That is not what satisfied him. Again and again, he desired to serve at the center of power. This means that Abravanel was not without ambition, because no statesman is without ambition. No man who achieves vast fortunes in Portugal and extraordinary success in Spain, and then upon experiencing disaster puts himself at the service of the rulers of the Italian states. No statesman does all this if he's lacking interest in attaining importance and influence. Abravanel is, of course, not the first rabbi to experience exile. But this is not the tale of Nachmanides, who upon expulsion from Spain goes on his solitary trip to the land of Israel. This is instead the tale of an exile who knows that he is a political genius, and he makes himself indispensable to government wherever he goes. This is a man who longs to wield power, to be a Jewish statesman. And thus, the critical question facing a Jewish statesman is, when the statesman is forced, the statesman who desires power, when the statesman is forced to choose between power on the one hand and faith on the other, what choice does the statesman make? We know what choice Abravanel made. He not only refused to convert, but he proudly spoke of Israel's eternity before Isabella herself. We do not often ponder the extraordinary nature of his choice, but consider the other prominent Jews in the court of the king. Abraham, Senior, first among them, Meir Melamed also. They in the end submitted. They refused to give up their lives in Spain. Abravanel was no less valued in the court. There is little that would have been denied him had he stayed. To him was truly offered that which only in theory seemed a possibility to Esther. Lihimalet Beit HaMelech mikol HaYehudim, to take refuge in the house of the king, as many Jews suffered, as long as he denied his identity. Abravanel's own grandfather had made that choice in less dire circumstances. It was the king himself and the most important cardinal in the land that served as the Catholic sponsors at the conversion of Abraham Senior. The honor Abravanel would have experienced from the king is beyond our imagining. But with all on the line, and with the most powerful monarchs in the world asking him to convert and take a place of honor beside them, Abravanel said no. And that one refusal proved his faith in all about Judaism that he believed, all about Judaism that he had told the Spanish queen. Think, ladies and gentlemen, what it would have meant for Sephardic Jewry, facing the greatest challenge to their faith and their lives in their community history, had Abravanel also agreed to convert. Abravanel giving up everything for his faith was the last act that occurred at the hand of a truly Jewish statesman on Spanish soil. And we remember it forever. What Netanyahu wrote about Abravanel's messianism after the expulsion can, I think, truly be said about Abravanel's last moments as a political actor in the court of the Spanish king. Quote, Abravanel lost the political battle for his people, and his struggle on their behalf in the courts of kings and magnates was, as he said, wasted effort. But Abravanel also fought for his people's soul, and in this struggle he won a complete victory. End quote. All too often, we honor statesmen for what they do. But in fact, it's often what statesmen refuse to do, what in the public eye, that more truly defines their legacy. Menachem Begin, for all that he did, would often cite his refusal to fire back on the Altalena as Jews were shooting at him as the most important moment in his life, because when he said no to Jews shooting at Jews, that prevented civil war. Here, Abravanel, with the eyes of Spanish Jewry upon him, and the other Jews at court abandoning their identity, Abravanel was asked to convert, and he said no. Abravanel may have initially hoped to save the Jews, and perhaps even to rectify thereby the standing of the name Abravanel in Spain. But in the end, few know of the Christian convert, Don Samuel Abravanel. But Isaac Abravanel's Jewish loyalty hovers over his entire legacy and lives on forever in the Jewish historical imagination. As indeed it must have lived on in the minds and hearts of the Jews who were his peers, who accompanied Abravanel into exile, and those of their children and their children's children. Several summers ago, I flew down to Florida in order to attend the wedding of a young man. The groom's family lives in Spain. They hail from Morocco, and the ketubah, the wedding document, read at their canopy, had some slight variations from the text that I was used to, because it was the version used by Jews of Morocco and Gibraltar, who had utilized this text for over 500 years since the expulsion from Castile. It was a special ketubah known as the ketubah of the exiles of Castile. The other difference, aside from the text, was that in this tradition the ketubah was not read under the canopy, it was sung to highlight joy at their union. So the family had a rabbi from Spain record a version of his singing the ketubah text. It was my job to do it at this wedding, and for weeks all I did was listen to the ketubah and then sing it to myself wherever I went. I studied the text, I learned the tune, I'm on the subway, I'm singing the ketubah of the Jews of Castile. And I had to go up and sing it in Florida before hundreds of people, and ladies and gentlemen, I nailed it. The ketubah, as I was singing it, concludes with the following words. V'hakol k'fi minhag v'atnai shenagu v'shitkinu kilat hakodesh hamegurashot mikastilla Hashem yishmor nishmatam v'yachon v'yarachem asherit pleitatam. All has been performed according to the traditions and laws of the holy community that has been exiled from Castile. May God keep their souls safe and bestow grace and mercy on the remnants of their exiles. And I stood there singing this ketubah, and I thought to myself, here we are, celebrating a Jewish marriage, marking a joyous moment, using the same tunes and words of the exiles of 1492. Over 500 years ago, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled their ancestors in the name of ensuring the eternity of their empire, and now their empire is gone. Ferdinand and Isabella are gone. And the Jews they expelled reflected the Jewish ability to build new homes after old ones were demolished, to create holiness in a new land after they were exiled from the last, to move on to consolation and rededication after destruction, and thereby prove every word of what Abravanel had said in the presence of Queen Isabella. It is not too much to say that every time the ketubah of Castile is read at a Sephardic wedding, Abravanel lives again. Because in the choice he made, he showed that he truly believed what he said to the Queen, that an eternal people always outlasts its enemies, and that Jews, who were experiencing a Tisha B'Av of Jewish history, were nevertheless certain of Purim's yet to come. The nighttime reading of the Megillah in Buchenwald that Rabbi Lau describes took place in 1945, a little more than a month before liberation from Patton's Third Army. The Jews reading the Megillah that night had little idea that Hitler's regime was about to collapse, and that the Nazis would no longer dominate Europe. But, Rabbi Lau writes, quote, the morning after the restrained holiday celebration, the Jews went out at dawn to forced labor. Some had trouble walking. Those who stumbled were buried in the snow, or else the Ukrainian guards beat them on the head with the butts of their rifles so they would never get up again. The same Jews, he writes, who told me about the Purim celebration in Buchenwald, also spoke about a chassid of Gur named Avraham Eliyahu. He became another one of the heroes of my childhood, one of the figures I recall fondly. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, the type we used to call a real Goliath, powerful and with an unusual personality to boot. Unlike most of the Jews, he had no problem walking to his work upright and with confidence. Instead of leading the line from the barracks, he insisted on bringing up the rear, and the whole way he would support the backs of those who had trouble walking. Avram the pusher, Avram the shtipper, Avram the pusher, Avram the booster, they used to call him in Yiddish. With his right hand he picked up the weak, with his left he straightened the bent, and with his chest he pushed them forward. If he saw one of his fellow Jews sway and fall, he would grab him quickly and give him a push, so that the man would continue walking on his own. Everyone thought of him, writes Rabbi Lau, as a remarkable figure. Even the Ukrainians admired him. The day after Purim Eve, after the reading of the improvised scroll, Avram pushed and saved Jews who faltered as usual. The Ukrainian guard, who had great respect for the tough Jew, could not restrain himself and whispered 2 words in Avram's ear. Hitler kaput. Hitler is done for. Within a minute, writes Rabbi Lau, the announcement spread like wildfire from Avram Eliyahu at the end of the line, all the way to the front. At once the weakest muscleman or the weakest laborer straightened their backs and began to walk unassisted. Someone in the middle of the procession began to mumble, and the others joined in. Arur Haman asher bikesh li abdi. Cursed is Haman who sought to destroy me. Shoshanat Yaakov tzahala v'samecha. The rose of Jacob resulted and exalted. This is the Purim song. The song of that night, writes Rabbi Lau, returned the next morning, about a month before the liberation. This, he concludes, was the only time the Jews ever sang on their way to forced labor in Buchenwald. To truly have faith as a Jew is to be able to mark Purim in the midst of Tisha B'Av, in the faith of a Purim that is yet to follow, in the faith that we will outlast our enemies because we are eternal people, because of our bond to God. And today, in an age of Jewish prosperity and power, where Jewish political achievement is pregnant with possibility, a statesman will never be truly Jewish without embodying the faith and the loyalty of Don Isaac Abravanel.